as I've talked about in previous shows, that there are 4 Yuga cycles. They're kind of like the 4 seasons here on planet Earth: the spring, summer, fall, and winter. For the last 5,000 years, we've moved into the winter of the Yuga cycles, the Kali Yuga. And during this age, that the amount of vice and degradation and lack of faith in the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the way people treat each other, the way people treat animals, the crime, the abortion, the divorce, the basic structure of the society, the honesty of the politicians, and many other things, they will all become degraded over time. So, in the same sense, if we look at the cosmology and the history of cosmology from that viewpoint, we could say that cosmology should move towards a more impersonal viewpoint and a more voidist viewpoint of the material world. It would be moving more away from a connection with the stars and planets and a removal of our identification with the stars and planets and our origins there. It would be moving away from a God-centered view of the universe with a universal creator and deputed powerful entities that take charge of different divisions of the process of creation. According to the flow of the age of Kali, it would have to become more impersonal as we go along. And we see that's the exact thing that happened in the history of cosmology, that we went from the ancient wisdom systems ideas of personalities creating a comfortable universe in which we could have our own perspective was valid, and that we moved over time to more and more impersonal viewpoints and more degraded, actually, viewpoints, and more disconnected viewpoints. Yes. So in that regard, that it kind of goes along with the flow of the ages. But in that sense, too, we can understand that we may be, instead of getting closer and closer to the truth, we may be moving further and further away from the truth. For example, I was just reading an article about how they've for many years they've used pulsating stars as a means to understand the dimensions of the universe. With the ancient Greek philosophy, at a certain point, when Copernicus came in with the sun-centered theory, what the philosophers and the scientists of the time started to believe in more was geometry and mathematics more than a supreme creator. And first that went to an Euclidean type of geometry where they imagined the universe to be like an infinite plane, because that's the way it works in Euclidean geometry, that there's an infinite plane and things are happening on that plane. So they imagined the universe, rather than being like a shell, a protective shell, and that there are personalities behind the creation, it moved gradually over time as we progressed through the Renaissance to more of a viewpoint where we're on a Euclidean plane of infinite dimension with stars dotting throughout it and planets, and that it was infinitely far, and the plane was infinitely long and infinitely wide, which in the cosmic shell situation, we can imagine something, well, what is beyond that shell? It would be the home of the Supreme Creator, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, whereas now if we look at it as an infinite plane, where exactly does that leave God? There's no more room for God, because there's nothing, everything is contained within this universe if it's infinitely long and infinitely wide and infinitely tall. So again, we see as we progress through the ages that everything becomes more impersonal. Of course, there were different problems with that. For one was Olbers Paradox, where Olber pointed out that if the universe was like an infinite plane, then along every sight line there should be stars, and that the night sky should be completely filled up with stars, and that they would actually be so bright that we would never experience darkness. You can look this up, Olbers Paradox, O-L-B-E-R-S, Paradox. And so this was one of the main things that scientists had to grapple with as they moved through their thoughts on cosmology, and the infinite plane theory with stars in every direction was that the entire night sky should be lit up by stars, and that actually we would be creating an intense heat. It would be actually an unbearable heat according to their calculations. So that's when they started to move into that more of a non-Euclidean. They had to deal with this paradox, and this is where Einstein comes in with his non-Euclidean geometry, where he basically said the universe, that space was curved, and that it wasn't exactly like the coverings that the ancients had thought of, rather that the space was curved, it had no boundary, but you could never escape it. And because they had to deal with this paradox of the plane theory, of the Euclidean plane theory. Anyway, Einstein came in with, it's basically getting back to the shell theory, only it was with the modern viewpoint that Einstein brought to it was that it's not exactly a shell, it's curved space, so you can never get out of it. Of course, this led to ultimately them saying that the universe was expanding because of Einstein's other equations. If he was right about the curved space and all the other things, he had to be right about, he tried to put in that cosmological fudge factor, but the other scientists point out that the universe had to be expanding. So this brings up the point, well, what is it expanding into if the universe is infinite and it has curved space, but it's still expanding? What is it expanding into? So they really have no answers to these questions. And but this is how we get to the Big Bang theory, that, this is the direction that the equations were taking them on, that the universe, according to Einstein, if his other theories were right, that it was a non-Euclidean situation, that it had to be expanding. And this is when this is in the early 1900s, and they started to come up with the Big Bang theory to fit the equations, that the universe could no longer be in a steady state, that it had to be expanding, ever expanding, in order to work with the equations. They found different flimsy evidence for this, and they decided that this became the latest dogma, that, of course, now with the electric universe theory and the other scientists pointing out, like, for example, I started on the example of they looked at these stars called Cephids, and these are pulsating stars, and they've used these stars to determine the distance of stars, the distance of other galaxies, but they found this one particular star that's rotating around another star, and it's on our very plane, it's on the right sight line, so that they can determine the mass of this particular star and its orbital velocity. What they found out just recently at a very big observatory in Europe, after making calculations with this pulsating star as it rotates around another star, and after doing all their calculations of orbital velocity and how often it pulsates, that they found that they're very far off from what they believe that the mass of stars, what the mass of the star is, and what the mass of stars in general are. And this has thrown the whole theory of star evolution out the window, basically. Of course, because of Popper pointed out that they're going to hold on to this theory for a long time. But they've proven beyond a shadow now that their methods for calculating the distance of planetary objects, the size of the universe, where different objects are located within the universe, that they've been wrong all along. So, according to Popper's theories of science, philosophy of science, they're going to, rather than just throwing this theory out immediately, what they're going to try to do is to hold on to this theory for a long time and to try to make adjustments to it. But the actual fact is, as of right now, all their equations and all their calculations as to the size of the universe, the distance of objects, everything has been thrown into chaos because they found that the mass of stars isn't as great as they thought, which hits at the very foundations of the theories of star evolution. And so again, we find problems with the inductive method, and we can look at the ancient wisdom systems more realistically as they become proven over and over again that they're correct, and that the modern theories have got so many problems, and there's such a lag time between when theories are proven false and what theories they're replaced with are, and by the time that filters down to the ordinary person and our perceptions of reality and our perceptions of the nature of the universe, that it basically takes lifetimes. And my premise is that the way we look at the universe affects our relationship with it, and affects our relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, because the impersonalistic theories that they've been putting forth for many, many years tends to move people away from the ancient wisdom systems and becoming in an intimate relationship with the creator of all that be. But as time moves on, we see that the ancient wisdom systems are proved right again and again. Let me give you another example of that. We can look at, in modern physics, the string theory. So they've had a big problem for a long time. They have the Einsteinian relativistic equations, which work very well with massive objects which have a large gravity. But the problem is now they have quantum theory, which works very well with tiny microscopic particles, beyond microscopic. What we're talking about, the atoms and the electrons and the protons and the particles that make them up, that the relativistic and the Einstein equations don't work well there, and they have a whole new theory called quantum physics. And these two theories are incompatible, quantum reality and relativistic reality. So they're looking for a unified theory that would encompass both. So what they've come up with is string theory. So I'd like to talk a little bit, give you just a very brief overview of the most modern and cutting-edge physics, what they're calling string theory. Think of a guitar string that has been tuned by stretching the string under tension across the guitar. Depending on how the string is plucked and how much tension is in the string, different musical notes will be created by the string. These musical notes could be said to be excitation modes of that guitar string under tension. In a similar manner, in string theory, the elementary particles we observe in particle accelerators could be thought of as the musical notes or excitation modes of elementary strings. So what they're saying here is that once you get down past the electrons and the neutrons and all this, in order for all their theories to work out, in order for it to be consolidated with the Einsteinian relativistic view, that basically everything is coming from sound vibration, and everything can be thought of in its most elementary form as a vibration of sound. So let's look at what the Vedas have been saying for 5,000 years plus. This comes from the Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 26, Verse 32, Fundamental Principles of Material Nature. When egoism and ignorance is agitated by the sex energy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the subtle element sound is manifested, and from sound come the ethereal sky and the sense of hearing. Purport. It appears from this verse that all the objects of our sense gratification are the products of egoism and ignorance. It is understood from this verse that by agitation of the element of egoism and ignorance, the first thing produced was sound, which is the subtle form of ether. It is also stated in the Vedanta Sutra that sound is the origin of all objects of material possession, and that by sound one can also dissolve this material existence. Anartha-vritti Shabdat means liberation by sound. The entire material manifestation began from sound, and sound can also end material entanglement if it has a particular potency. So here again we see that the most current and modern theories of physics are exactly jibing with the ancient wisdom system of the Vedas, in that when the ultimate elemental beginning of the material world and material elements is sound vibration. So it's taken them so long, so many hundreds of years, to come to these conclusions because, according to Popper and his philosophy of science, that most theories to begin with aren't even scientific because they can never be proven to be false. The few theories that are scientific, because at some point they can be proven to be false, when proven false, they tend to tinker with and hold on to for 50 or 100 years. And